Back in February 2021, a massive winter storm hit Texas and plunged the state into darkness and freezing cold. But this wasn't just another bad storm. It was a catastrophic failure of a modern power grid, the very system that underpins, well, everything in our society. So today, we're going to conduct an engineering autopsy to figure out exactly how it happened and what it really means for all of us.
Now, this quote from the guy who was in charge of the Texas grid operator, ERCOT, this is not an exaggeration. As absolutely terrifying as the rolling blackouts were for millions of people, what they just barely avoided was almost unimaginable, a complete, uncontrolled collapse of the entire state's electrical system.
4 minutes and 37 seconds. That's it. According to the data analysis done after the event, that's how close the grid came to what's called a black start scenario. That's a total system failure that could have taken not just days, but weeks, or maybe even months to fully repair, leaving millions of people in the dark. So how in the world does a modern grid, a grid that serves 26 million people, get just 4 minutes away from total disaster? Well, to understand that, we first need to dive into the fundamental physics that govern our entire electrical world. Okay, so try to think of the power grid as one gigantic, perfectly synchronized machine. Every single generator, whether it's gas, coal, or wind, is spinning in perfect lockstep to maintain this constant, steady rhythm, 60 cycles per second, or 60 hertz. This is basically the grid's heartbeat. If power supply and demand are perfectly balanced, that heart beats steady. But if supply suddenly craters, that heartbeat starts to slow down. What this shows is just how razor-thin the margins for error really are. At exactly 60 hertz, everything is great. But as power plants started tripping offline from the cold, that frequency fell. Once it hit 59.3 hertz, automatic safety systems kicked in, and they started cutting power to homes, that's load shedding, to try and save the whole system. But below 57 hertz, well, that's the point of no return. Generators are programmed to just disconnect themselves to prevent damage, causing a final, unstoppable cascade into a total blackout. But wait a minute, why was Texas in this position in the first place? Why couldn't it just import power from neighboring states during the emergency? Well, the answer lies in a very deliberate, decades-old decision to be an electrical island. This comparison really highlights the core difference here. You see, the rest of the continental U.S. is split into two massive, interconnected grids that can share huge amounts of power across state lines. But the Texas grid, ERCOT, stands almost completely alone. And this was an intentional choice, made a long time ago, to avoid federal regulation. The consequence? When crisis hit, its ability to import emergency power was less than 1% of what it desperately needed. Texas was on its own. It had to face the storm alone. And then, the perfect storm arrived. A polar vortex brought Arctic temperatures deep into a state that's just not built for that kind of cold. This created a brutal double whammy. As millions of people cranked up their heat, demand for electricity shot up to a record high. And at the exact same time, the power plants that were needed to meet that demand were literally freezing solid. So this wasn't a single point of failure. Not even close. It was a catastrophic domino effect, where every interconnected part of the system started to break down all at the same time. The data really tells the true story here. Early on, a lot of people were pointing fingers at frozen wind turbines, but the numbers tell a very different story. While wind power definitely underperformed, the single biggest source of failure, by a huge margin, was natural gas, the supposed backbone of the Texas grid. In fact, thermal generation as a whole, so that's natural gas, coal, and nuclear, accounted for the vast majority of the power that was lost. And why did they fail? It wasn't one single complex issue, it was 100 simple ones. These massive power plants are filled with all these small but critical components, pipes, sensors, valves, that were just not protected from a deep freeze. Moisture froze inside control lines, coolant pipes burst, and even lubricants became too thick to flow, like molasses. It was a widespread failure of basic winterization. And this illustrates the single most critical failure of the whole event, a vicious feedback loop. Gas power plants need gas to run, simple enough. But the gas wells and compressors that supply that fuel, they need electricity to run. So when the blackouts started, they cut power to the gas producers, which then choked off the fuel supply to the power plants, which of course caused even more blackouts. It was a death spiral. Maybe the most infuriating part of this entire story is that none of it was a surprise. This exact type of catastrophic failure had happened before.
And the warnings were crystal clear. Just look at this history. In 1989, a cold snap caused major failures, and regulators recommended weatherizing equipment. What did Texas do? They made it voluntary. So in 2011, it happened again. This time, a detailed federal report explicitly warned that this would keep happening if weatherization wasn't made mandatory. That recommendation was rejected. So when Winter Storm Uri hit in 2021, the outcome was tragically predictable.
So why? Why wouldn't power companies make these common sense investments? Well, it comes down to the market design. Texas runs on something called an energy-only market. That means you get paid for the electricity you sell, and that's it. You don't get paid for being on standby as a backup. This creates a really powerful disincentive to spend millions on weather protection for a storm that might only happen once in a decade. The market was designed for normal days, and it failed catastrophically on an abnormal one.
And the financial result of that market logic is just staggering. The estimated cost to properly winterize the grid was a few $100 million. The economic damage from the failure? It's been estimated as high as $195 billion. That is a staggering 600-to-1 ratio between the cost of prevention and the cost of the disaster.
So, after a failure of this magnitude, the key question really is, what's changed? And are we actually ready for the next time? First, we just have to acknowledge the devastating human cost. The official death toll was 246, but independent studies suggest it was much closer to 700. 15 million people lost access to clean water. For millions, this wasn't just an inconvenience. It was a full-blown humanitarian crisis. Now, in the wake of the disaster, the Texas legislature did act. They passed Senate Bill 3, and it finally mandates weatherization for power plants and for critical natural gas facilities. There are now actual rules and enforcement mechanisms in place, and that is tangible progress. So the grid is without a doubt stronger today than it was in 2021. But those fundamental questions, they remain. Texas is still an electrical island. Its market structure still faces challenges when it comes to rewarding investment in long-term resilience. And we all know extreme weather is becoming more frequent and more severe. So the final question is this: being better prepared is good, but in the face of what's coming, is it good enough?